This pen works. What does this statement mean? What am I saying here? I am saying that this pen is effective at serving its intended function. In this case, to write. Of course, in the event that it ran out of ink, I would still be justified in saying that it worked if I were to specify a different function. What do you mean it works? I can't get it to write. Oh, I mean it works for scratching behind one's ear. Oh, you're right. So before one is justified in saying that something works, one must have a function in mind. When someone talks about something working, he or she is usually testifying to its effectiveness at serving a default or otherwise specified function. So what does it mean then when a believer talks about the power of prayer? How well prayer works? What is the function served by prayer? Consider that usually, believers try to demonstrate the power of prayer, how well it works, by pointing to personal accounts of times when someone has prayed for something to happen, and it miraculously has. Of course, the only way such may lend any support whatsoever to claims about the power of prayer is if the events in question have actually happened. I'm afraid people sometimes make things up, and that they otherwise wouldn't have happened, which is an utterly untestable, unsupportable, unknowable supposition. Such is also an example of confirmation bias and cherry-picking. But what about the times when people pray for something to happen, and it doesn't? Well, they make excuses for it. Either they tell themselves that they just need to have patience because it will happen one day, or they tell themselves that they're not doing it right, or that it's not part of God's plan. I'll come back to this last one in just a moment. They're supposedly not fervent enough about it, or they're not doing it with enough devotion. Of course, if this is not the actual reason, there's no way to tell. But as the believers are so fond of reminding us, they make up the majority. On one fateful day, they must have made up the majority of the population of New York City. On a more recent fateful day, they must have made up the majority of the population of Haiti as well. So of course, in each case, making up the majority of those caught in the rubble, they have provided abundant individual anecdotal accounts of this great miracle in which they prayed that they would survive long enough to be rescued, and lo and behold, they did. The important factor, though, in assessing this is what percentage of the time this flurry of anecdotes composes. If believers make up the majority of New York City and Haiti, then they probably also make up the majority of those who died in the rubble before rescuers could reach them. What do we hear of such people? What do we hear of those who prayed to survive until rescuers reached them, and then it didn't happen? Nothing, of course. One does not survive to relate the miraculous account of how one did not survive. Indeed, what about believers who are also sports fans? If you're a sports fan who believes in the power of prayer, and you're at a game, you're probably praying for your team to win. But what about the people who believe in the power of prayer and are praying for the other team to win? You can be certain that one of you is not going to have your prayers answered. What if there are 1,000 people competing on the likes of American Idol, and 990 of them are believers? That means that at the very least, 989 of them are guaranteed not to have their prayers answered. That is a success rate of barely more than 0.1%. What about gambling? A lot of believers are very quick to condemn the practice in the name of God, and the majority of this country's population are believers, but the likes of Vegas and Reno are getting their business from somewhere. I rather suspect there's a fair bit of praying going on there. But look how well off are the people who own casinos. Where does their wealth come from? Am I to infer that the overwhelming majority of people playing, praying, and paying in casinos just don't have the technique right? In the end, in the long run, the house wins the overwhelming majority of the time, just as these statistics say it ought to. What about higher stakes? What if the two sides pitted against one another in a war are each praying for victory? Look at either side, and when the fighting is going well for them, they credit God, but when it's going poorly, they blame themselves. So whenever one side is thanking God, the other is blaming themselves. This is the predictable result. After all, Abraham Lincoln, regarding the Civil War, once said, "Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other." But the previously mentioned accounts rely on the intended function of prayer being to cause to happen things which otherwise wouldn't. If this function is anything else, then surely these accounts can't offer the power of prayer even the flimsiest of support. The only way personal accounts of people causing things to happen by prayer can lend any support whatsoever to claims about the power of prayer is if causing things to happen which otherwise wouldn't is in fact the function of prayer. Let me emphasize that. If the function of prayer is anything else at all, these accounts cannot lend it any support. Now consider, most of the people insisting on the power of prayer also have no difficulty whatsoever believing in God's plan. Everything is fixed, they say, and you can't change it. That which is part of the plan simply will happen, and that which isn't simply won't. So goes the rhetoric. What if an event takes place that someone was just praying for? What's the reason it happened? Did it happen because someone prayed for it, or because it was part of God's plan? If it's true that events which are part of God's plan are going to happen no matter what, cannot be prevented by anything, that means they cannot even be prevented by prayer or lack of prayer. They are going to happen whether anyone's praying for them or not. What if, on the other hand, it's true that events which are not part of God's plan are not going to happen no matter what? Well, surely, if this rhetoric is true, it means they won't happen even if every single person in the world is praying for them. What if it's possible to cause with prayer events which otherwise weren't part of that plan, weren't going to happen? It can only mean either that it is possible to cause events which aren't part of the plan, or that with prayer one can persuade God to change his plan. If the former is the case, it means that the rhetoric is mistaken. If the latter is the case, it means that God is willing to change a plan based on his own wisdom and awareness, both of which I'm told are infinitely greater than ours, in deference to ours. Now, if you sincerely believe that God's wisdom and awareness are infinitely greater than yours, you have to figure that there is no consideration you could make that he hasn't. Are you sure you want him to make such a difference? What if the occurrence you're praying for is an event God does not want? What if, on the other hand, the occurrence you're praying against is something God does want? But then sometimes I am told that the intended function of prayer is not to ask for things, but to thank God for all he has given. Well, if that's the case, these accounts of people praying for things to happen, which then do, can lend no support whatsoever to the claim that prayer works. Sometimes I am also told that the point of prayer, the purpose of it, is simply to feel God. Well, this claim has the same problem. By the way, what does God feel like? Can you describe the feeling? I know very well that if you get yourself psyched up enough, you can induce yourself to see, hear, or feel virtually anything, including something so vague as profundity. But how do you know that the profound sensation coming over you is the touch of God? How do you know it isn't one of Vishnu's many hands? How do you know it isn't Sentiotl trying to hook you up with a free ear of corn? It could very well be his noodly goodness trying to tickle you, or the magic sandwich asking you to join him in fluting people off. You can't disprove any of these possibilities, now can you? But all the kidding aside, you and I both know, the overwhelming majority of the time when a believer turns to prayer, it's to ask for things. Maybe very specific things, like a rescue from the rubble or a promotion at work, or very general things, like health and prosperity. I can only conclude that, when prayer is taking place, thought isn't. Prayer impedes reason. Perhaps that is the intended function.